Sometimes the people we judge, the harshest, teach us the most about ourselves. Sometimes the voice of wisdom comes from the last place we'd think to look. In Cedar Falls, wealthy CEO Vivienne Langley walks into Murphy's auto shop expecting quick service. Instead, she meets Jack Reyes, a mechanic who changes her world with just a few words. When Vivienne mocks his intelligence, Jack responds in perfect Latin, leaving her stunned. But Jack isn't just any mechanic. He's a former classics professor, hiding a painful secret. Their confrontation goes viral, but it's just the beginning. As Vivienne returns to apologize, she discovers a man whose calloused hands hold more wisdom than her boardroom ever did. What tragedy forced a brilliant professor to abandon everything he loved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm chimed at 5:30, as it had every weekday morning for the past 8 years. Vivienne Langley's penthouse apartment overlooked the city skyline, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a view that real estate agents called breathtaking, and she had long since stopped noticing. The coffee maker had already begun its quiet ritual, programmed the night before, filling the pristine kitchen with the aroma of imported beans that cost more per pound than most people spent on groceries in a week. At 42, Vivienne moved through her morning routine with the precision of someone who had learned that efficiency was survival. Shower, exactly 12 minutes. Hair and makeup, 25 minutes, no more. The charcoal suit hung pressed and waiting, chosen not for beauty, but for the message it sent. Serious, uncompromising, successful. The Langley Industries board meeting was at 9, and there would be quarterly projections to review, acquisitions to approve, and the usual parade of executives who smiled to her face while calculating how long she might hold onto her father's company. She had inherited the empire at 34, when Richard Langley's heart attack took him during what the newspapers called the deal of the decade. The transition had been brutal, months of legal battles with distant relatives who questioned whether a woman, even his daughter, could handle a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Vivienne had answered their doubts with 16-hour days, strategic acquisitions that doubled their market share, and a ruthless efficiency that made her father's legendary business acumen look almost gentle by comparison. The elevator descended 43 floors in silence, carrying her to the parking garage where her vintage Mercedes convertible waited. It had been her father's car, a 1970 280 SL, that he'd restored himself in the rare moments when business allowed such indulgences. She kept it not from sentimentality. Vivienne had long ago learned that sentiment was a luxury CEOs couldn't afford, but because it reminded her daily of what dedication could accomplish. Every gleaming surface, every perfectly tuned component spoke of patience, attention to detail, and the kind of craftsmanship that built lasting things. The drive to the office normally took 37 minutes, traffic permitting. Vivienne used the time to review emails, returning calls through the car's Bluetooth system, her assistant's voice providing updates on market fluctuations and scheduling conflicts. She had learned to multitask, not from business school, though she had graduated summa cum laude from Wharton, but from necessity. There simply weren't enough hours in the day to run a company the size of Langley Industries while maintaining the facade of a personal life her public relations team insisted was essential for brand humanization. 2 hours north of the city, in the small town of Cedar Falls, Jack Reyes was already 3 cups of coffee into his morning. Murphy's auto shop opened at 7, but Jack had been there since 6, the way he had every day for the past 12 years. The shop smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, honest scents that reminded him why he preferred working with his hands to the sterile world of lecture halls and faculty meetings he'd left behind. At 45, Jack had the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from genuine work, calloused hands that knew the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead by touch. shoulders broadened by years of lifting engines, and lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into car hoods, and before that, into books by lamplight. His dark hair showed grey at the temples, and he wore it slightly longer than was fashionable, tied back when he worked. There was something in his bearing that suggested depth, the way certain old buildings hinted at hidden rooms and forgotten stories. The first car of the day belonged to Mrs. Henderson, whose ancient Buick had been making that noise again for the better part of 3 months. Jack had replaced her alternator, checked her belts, and cleaned her battery terminals. But the real problem was that the car was 30 years old, and Mrs. Henderson was on a fixed income. So he performed small miracles of maintenance, stretching the life of worn parts and refusing payment more often than his business partner Murphy appreciated. "You can't fix every car in town for free, Jack," Murphy had said more than once, but he said it with the resignation of someone who knew his partner's character too well to expect change. Murphy was 73, had owned the shop for 45 years, and had taken Jack in when he'd arrived in Cedar Falls looking like a man running from something he couldn't outrun. In his small apartment above Henderson's Hardware, Jack kept a library that would have impressed most university professors. Shelves lined every wall, filled with volumes in Latin, Greek, Italian, and English classical literature, philosophy, history, poetry. The books were the only things he'd brought from his former life, carefully packed and moved with a tenderness that he rarely showed for anything else. Hidden among them, tucked behind a first edition of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, was a worn copy of Cicero's De Officiis, on duties that he'd once used to teach undergraduate courses on classical rhetoric. Sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Jack would pull down one of the volumes and read by the window that faced the town's main street. The words felt like conversations with old friends, reminders of a time when his days were filled with eager young faces and the eternal questions that had fascinated humanity for thousands of years. But those memories came with others, sharper ones that could still take his breath away, so he rationed them carefully, the way a man might ration medicine that was both cure and poison. The town of Cedar Falls had a population of just over 8,000, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business but minded their own, unless specifically invited to comment. There was a main street lined with family businesses: Henderson's Hardware, Rosie's Diner, the Cedar Falls Bank, Trust, and Murphy's Auto Shop. The high school football team was called the Pioneers, and their Friday night games drew crowds that included 3 generations of the same families. It was the sort of place that people either loved for its sense of community or found suffocating in its familiarity. Jack had found it healing. After 12 years, he was no longer the mysterious stranger who'd appeared one autumn with more education than the town typically saw, and a sadness that kept most people at a respectful distance. He was simply Jack, the man who could fix anything with an engine, who never missed a town council meeting, who helped elderly residents with their groceries and never mentioned it afterward. The transformation from Dr. Jackson Reyes, Associate Professor of Classical Studies, to Jack the mechanic hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary in ways that most people would never understand. His small house on Maple Street sat on a quarter-acre lot that he'd transformed into a garden that was equal parts practical and beautiful. Tomatoes and peppers grew alongside roses and jasmine, and in the back corner, partially hidden by a trellis of morning glories, stood a workbench where he restored vintage motorcycles. It was patient work, the kind that rewarded careful attention and punished haste, qualities that his former profession had taught him and his current one reinforced daily. The morning sun slanted through the shop's windows as Jack finished Mrs. Henderson's Buick and moved on to the next vehicle, a delivery truck from Rosie's Diner that needed new brake pads. The work was methodical, satisfying in its concrete results. When he tightened a bolt, it stayed tight. When he replaced a worn part, the problem was solved. There was something to be said for that kind of clarity, that immediate feedback between effort and result. In his teaching days, he'd never quite known if his students truly understood the elegance of Latin syntax or the relevance of Stoic philosophy to modern life. Here, engines either ran or they didn't. Murphy arrived at 8:30, as he did every morning, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner and a newspaper tucked under his arm. He'd been trying to retire for the past 5 years, but his wife had made it clear that she didn't want him underfoot all day, and the truth was that he loved the shop too much to let go completely. He and Jack had fallen into a comfortable partnership, Murphy handling the books and customer relations, Jack doing most of the actual repair work. "Morning, Professor," Murphy said, using the nickname he'd adopted despite Jack's repeated requests to drop it. It was said with affection rather than mockery, but it never failed to remind Jack of the life he'd left behind. "Morning, Murph," Jack replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Mrs. Henderson's car is ready. I think we bought her another 6 months." Murphy nodded, settling into the ancient office chair behind the desk that served as their command center. The morning would bring a steady stream of customers, farmers with tractors, commuters with sedans, teenagers with pickup trucks they'd bought with summer job money. Each vehicle told a story, and Jack had learned to read them like the ancient texts he'd once studied, understanding the history written in wear patterns and maintenance records. Neither man could have predicted that this particular morning would bring a vintage Mercedes convertible, carrying a woman whose world was about to collide with theirs in ways that would change everything. Sometimes the most significant moments in our lives arrive disguised as ordinary inconveniences, and sometimes the people we're meant to meet are the ones we least expect to understand. The first sign of trouble came at 10:15, just as Vivienne was reviewing third-quarter projections on her way to inspect a potential acquisition site an hour outside the city. The Mercedes had been running perfectly until it wasn't. The engine coughed once, then twice, before settling into an irregular rhythm that made her stomach clench with the particular anxiety that comes from mechanical problems at the worst possible time. She pulled over at the first safe spot, a gas station at the edge of Cedar Falls, and tried calling her usual mechanic. Voicemail. Her backup service was booked until Thursday. The meeting she was driving to represented a $40 million deal, and she was expected in 20 minutes. This was exactly the kind of situation that reminded her why she preferred control to spontaneity. "Excuse me," she said to the teenage gas station attendant, who was more interested in his phone than in helping customers. "Where's the nearest auto repair shop?" He gestured vaguely down the street without looking up. "Murphy's, that way, can't miss it." Murphy's auto shop sat on Main Street like a relic from a simpler time, its weathered sign promising honest work, fair prices in faded letters. The building itself looked like it had been there since the town was founded, all red brick and large windows designed to let in natural light. Several cars in various stages of repair filled the parking area, and the sound of an air compressor echoed from the open bay doors. Vivienne parked and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. The charcoal suit that commanded respect in boardrooms suddenly felt out of place, but she straightened her shoulders and walked in with the confidence that had carried her through hostile takeovers and skeptical investors. "Hello?" she called out, stepping into the garage. The smell hit her immediately, motor oil, metal, and something indefinably masculine that spoke of hard work and honest sweat. A man emerged from beneath the hood of an old pickup truck, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. This had to be the mechanic. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair tied back and the kind of build that came from actual physical labor rather than expensive gyms. His work shirt was clean but permanently stained, and there was something about the way he moved that suggested competence. But what caught her attention were his eyes, dark brown, intelligent, and currently assessing her with an expression that was polite but decidedly unimpressed. "Can I help you?" he asked. And even in those 3 words, Vivienne caught something that surprised her. His voice was educated, carefully modulated in a way that spoke of good schools and careful attention to diction. "Yes, I hope so. My car seems to be having engine trouble. I was wondering..." If you might take a look. She gestured toward the Mercedes, which looked absurdly expensive next to the working-class vehicles that filled the lot. The mechanic Jack, according to the name embroidered on his shirt, glanced at the car and then back at her. I can take a look, but I've got 3 jobs ahead of you. Might be a couple hours before I can get to it. A couple of hours? Vivienne felt her careful composure slip slightly. I'm afraid that won't work. I have an important meeting, and I really need this resolved as quickly as possible. Jack's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he'd heard this song before. Well, ma'am, I understand that, but these other folks have been waiting too, and some of them need their cars to get to work tomorrow. I can't just bump them because... He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. Because what? The question came out sharper than she'd intended. Because your car costs more than most people make in a year. The words hung in the air between them, and Vivienne felt her temper flare. She wasn't used to being spoken to this way, wasn't accustomed to people who didn't immediately defer to her obvious success and authority. I see. Well, perhaps you don't understand the situation. This is a business emergency, and I'm willing to pay extra for immediate service. Jack set down his rag and looked at her directly. Money doesn't change the laws of physics, ma'am. I've still got to diagnose the problem, and that takes however long it takes. Throwing cash at a carburetor doesn't make it fix itself no faster. The grammar error hit her ears like nails on a chalkboard. Without thinking, she corrected him. Any faster. The phrase is any faster, not no faster. The silence that followed was deafening. Jack's expression shifted, and not in a way that suggested gratitude for the lesson. Around them, the normal sounds of the garage, the hiss of the air compressor, the clink of tools, seemed to grow louder in the sudden tension. I beg your pardon? His voice was quiet, dangerously so. Vivienne realized she'd crossed a line, but pride and frustration pushed her forward. I was simply pointing out a grammatical error. If you're going to speak to customers, proper English might be... Might be what? Jack stepped closer, and she could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Might be more impressive, more professional, more worthy of serving someone like you? The conversation had spiraled beyond anything she'd intended, but somehow she couldn't stop herself. The stress of the morning, the anxiety about the delayed meeting, and the frustration of being trapped in a situation she couldn't control, all combined into something ugly and sharp. I'm simply saying that education matters. Communication skills are important in any profession. Education. Jack repeated the word, like he was tasting something bitter. You think because I work with my hands, because I've got grease under my fingernails, that I'm somehow lacking in education? I think that if you had better options, you probably wouldn't be... She never got to finish the sentence. Jack's laugh was sharp and entirely without humor. Lady, you want to know about education? You want to hear some proper English? Without warning, he began to speak, and the words that came out of his mouth were nothing like what she'd expected. Quodsi contentionis quaedam et certamina honestorum officiorum constituentur, magnam habebunt dubitationem, quae potissimum siqui aut fugere debemus. The Latin flowed from his lips with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years not just studying the language, but living with it, thinking in it, teaching it. The accent was perfect, the syntax flawless, and the quotation from Cicero's De Officiis was delivered with the kind of authority that comes only from deep, scholarly understanding. Vivienne stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as Jack continued. That's Cicero, from On Duties, roughly translated. But if certain conflicts and struggles arise between honorable duties, they will create great doubt about which we ought to follow or avoid. Seemed appropriate given the circumstances. The color drained from her face as the implications hit her. This wasn't just a mechanic who happened to remember some Latin from high school. This was someone who knew classical literature well enough to quote it from memory, someone who understood not just the words but their deeper meaning, their relevance to human nature and moral choice. You, she began, but her voice caught. Yeah, Jack said, his tone now flat and tired. I know Latin, I know Greek too, if you're interested. Bit rusty on my Sanskrit, but I can probably manage a few lines if you need me to prove something else about my qualifications." Before she could respond, before she could begin to process what had just happened, a voice from behind her said, "Holy shit, did you get that?" They both turned to see a young man, maybe 19 or 20, holding up his smartphone with obvious excitement. He'd been recording, probably for TikTok or Instagram, and had captured the entire exchange. "That was amazing," the kid continued. "The whole thing, her making fun of you, then you just dropping that bomb on her. Dude, this is going to go viral." And just like that, Vivienne realized that her morning had become something far worse than a simple mechanical problem. In the space of 5 minutes, she'd managed to publicly humiliate herself, reveal her own prejudices, and have the entire interaction recorded for the entertainment of strangers on the internet. Jack looked at the phone, then at her, and shook his head. "Turn that off, Tyler." But Tyler was already uploading, his fingers flying over the screen. "No way, man. This is gold. Rich lady tries to school mechanic, mechanic schools her back in ancient Latin. It's perfect." The video was already online. Vivienne could see it in the kid's eyes, the excitement of someone who knew he'd captured something that would get attention. In a matter of hours, maybe less, her humiliation would be shared across social media platforms, dissected by strangers, turned into memes and commentary. She looked at Jack, searching for something to say, some way to undo what had just happened. But he was watching her with an expression that was no longer angry, just tired, deeply tired, as if this conversation had drained something essential from him. "Your car," he said finally, "will be ready when it's ready. You can wait in the office if you want, or there's a diner down the street. It's up to you." And with that, he turned back to the pickup truck he'd been working on, dismissing her as completely as if she'd never existed. Vivienne stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of her mistake settling around her like a heavy coat, before walking back to her car to wait for the storm she knew was coming. The video had 6 million views by the time Vivienne made it back to her office. Her assistant, Monica, met her at the elevator with the expression of someone delivering news about a terminal diagnosis. "The board has called an emergency meeting for 4 o'clock, Monica said, falling into step beside her. "Legal wants to discuss response strategies. PR is having what I can only describe as a collective nervous breakdown, and your phone has been ringing non-stop reporters, mostly, but also some very angry investors." Vivienne walked to her office windows and looked out at the city that suddenly felt foreign. On her phone, the video played on an endless loop. "Rich woman mocks mechanic's grammar, gets destroyed by perfect Latin" had already spawned dozens of reaction videos, memes, and commentary pieces. The comments section was a mixture of celebration and condemnation, strangers debating her character based on 90 seconds of the worst version of herself. "Find out everything you can about him," she told Monica. "The mechanic, Jack Reyes." Already on it, Monica consulted her tablet. Dr. Jackson Eduardo Reyes, age 45, former associate professor of classical studies at Northwestern University, published extensively on Cicero and Stoic philosophy, left academia 12 years ago under circumstances that aren't entirely clear. No scandal, no controversy, just resigned mid-semester and disappeared. The information hit Vivienne like a physical blow. Dr. Jackson Reyes. She'd spent the morning humiliating a man who probably had more advanced degrees than she did, who'd chosen to work with his hands not from lack of options, but for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. "There's more," Monica continued carefully. "I found an old faculty photo. He was married, had a daughter. Wife died in a car accident when the child was 8. The daughter," she paused, consulting her notes, "Sofia Elena Reyes. She died of leukemia at age 14. 6 months later, he resigned from the university." The words settled into Vivienne's chest like stones. A daughter, a child who died of cancer while still young enough to believe the world was fundamentally good. No wonder he'd left the academic world, with its abstractions and theoretical discussions of suffering, to work with engines and carburetors, things that either functioned or didn't, problems that could actually be solved. "Ma'am?" Monica's voice seemed to come from very far away. "The board meeting? Cancel it," Vivienne said. "Tell them I'm handling this personally." "Cancel it? Vivienne, this is a crisis management situation. The stock price has already dropped 2 points, and I said cancel it." The sharpness in her own voice surprised her. "And Monica, stop calling him the mechanic. His name is Dr. Reyes." That evening, Vivienne sat at her kitchen island with a legal pad, trying to write an apology letter. She'd started and crumpled 6 different versions, each one sounding either too corporate, too casual, or too obviously crafted by a public relations team. How did you apologize for revealing yourself to be exactly the kind of person you'd always claimed not to be? The truth was uncomfortable. She had assumed that Jack's grammatical slip meant he was uneducated, that his choice to work as a mechanic indicated a lack of better options. She judged him based on his appearance, his profession, and her own unconscious biases about what success looked like. The video had captured not just a moment of poor judgment, but a glimpse into something ugly in her character that she'd never wanted to acknowledge. Outside her penthouse windows, the city glittered with thousands of lights, each one representing someone living a life she knew nothing about. How many people had she dismissed over the years? How many conversations had she approached with the assumption that her education, her wealth, her position made her inherently superior to whoever she was speaking with? She picked up her pen and began to write. "Dr. Reyes, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the incident at your shop today. You were right to call out my behavior, and I was wrong in every possible way, wrong to assume, wrong to judge, and wrong to speak to you with such disrespect. I've spent the day learning about your background, not to use it against you, but to understand the depth of my mistake. You gave up a distinguished academic career for reasons that I can only imagine were deeply personal and painful. That you chose honest work with your hands over the ivory tower speaks to character, not lack of opportunity. Your Latin was beautiful, by the way. Cicero would have approved of both your pronunciation and your timing. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I understand how badly I behaved and how little I deserve the grace you showed by not escalating the situation further. With sincere regret, Vivienne Langley." She read it over twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Tomorrow, she would drive back to Cedar Falls, not to manage a crisis or protect her reputation, but to deliver an apology that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with being human. Meanwhile, 60 miles north, Jack was trying to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of evening chores. He'd fed the cats that appeared at his back door, each night strays that had somehow decided his garden was neutral territory and was watering the tomatoes when Murphy appeared with 2 bottles of beer. "Figured you might need these," the older man said, settling into one of the mismatched chairs on Jack's small porch. "Hell of a day." Jack accepted the beer gratefully. "Tyler shouldn't have recorded that. Kid meant well. Thought you handled yourself pretty good, actually. About time someone called out that kind of behavior." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the maple trees that lined the street. Finally, Murphy spoke again. "You ever think about going back? To teaching, I mean?" It wasn't the first time Murphy had asked, and Jack's answer was always the same. "This is enough." But tonight, for the first time in 12 years, he wondered if that was still true. The Latin had felt good coming out of his mouth, natural, in a way that surprised him. For just a moment, he'd been Dr. Reyes again, the man who could make Cicero come alive for undergraduates, who could help them see the relevance of ancient wisdom to modern life. Of course, that man had also failed to save his daughter, had watched her waste away in hospital beds while he sat helpless with all his education and none of the knowledge that mattered. The classics were full of noble suffering and philosophical acceptance, but they offered no comfort to a father watching his child die by degrees. She was out of line, Murphy said, as if reading his thoughts. But she didn't know about Sophia. Doesn't matter. Shouldn't matter. Jack took a long pull from his beer. You don't get to be cruel to people just because you don't know their whole story. No, Murphy agreed. But sometimes good people do cruel things when they're scared or frustrated. Sometimes they get a chance to make it right. Jack looked at his friend and business partner, this man who'd taken him in when he'd arrived in Cedar Falls, broken and desperate for work that would tire his body enough to quiet his mind. Murphy had never asked about his past, had simply put tools in his hands and shown him how to rebuild carburetors instead of his life. You think she'll be back? Jack asked. I think, Murphy said carefully, that she looked like someone who'd just seen herself clearly for the first time in a long while. People don't usually like what they see in that moment, but it's the only place real change starts. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for grace or failure. But tonight, Jack allowed himself to remember what it felt like to speak the language he'd once loved, to draw on knowledge that had shaped him long before grief had reshaped everything. Perhaps Murphy was right. Perhaps tomorrow would bring someone seeking not just mechanical repairs, but the kind of healing that could only come from honest conversation and the courage to start over. Vivienne arrived at Murphy's auto shop the next morning at 7:30, carrying 2 cups of coffee from what she hoped was the best place in town and an envelope containing her handwritten apology. The Mercedes was parked exactly where she'd left it, but Jack was already working on another car, his movements efficient and purposeful in the morning light. He looked up when she approached, and she caught something in his expression, not anger, exactly, but a wariness that suggested he was expecting another confrontation. She couldn't blame him for that. Dr. Reyes, she began, then stopped. I'm sorry, is it Dr. Reyes, or do you prefer Jack? I don't want to make assumptions. Jack is fine, he said carefully, setting down his wrench, though I appreciate you asking. She held out one of the coffee cups. I brought you this. I wasn't sure how you liked it, so I got it black, and I wanted to give you this. She extended the envelope with her letter. Jack accepted both offerings, but didn't open the letter immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a small seating area near the office, 2 metal chairs that had seen better days, but were clean and positioned to catch the morning sun. Would you mind if we sat for a minute? She asked. I have some things I'd like to say, if you're willing to listen. They settled into the chairs, and Vivienne took a moment to gather her thoughts. In the daylight, without the stress and embarrassment of yesterday's encounter, she could see details she'd missed before. Jack's hands, for instance, calloused from years of mechanical work, but with long fingers that would have been at home holding chalk or turning pages. There was something in his posture that spoke of education, a way of holding himself that suggested he was accustomed to being listened to. I've been thinking about yesterday, she began, about what I said and how I said it. There's no excuse for my behavior, but I wanted you to know that I understand how wrong I was. Jack sipped his coffee and waited for her to continue. I made assumptions about you based on your profession, and that was both ignorant and arrogant. I've spent the evening learning about your background, not to intrude on your privacy, but to understand the full scope of my mistake. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I'm sorry about your daughter. The words seemed to land like a physical blow. Jack's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might get up and walk away. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. Sophia would have been 26 this year. She wanted to be a veterinarian, loved animals more than people, most days. Smart as hell, stubborn as a mule, and braver than anyone should have to be at 14. He looked directly at Vivienne. She never would have spoken to someone the way you spoke to me yesterday. The rebuke was gentle but devastating. Vivienne felt tears prick at her eyes, not from self-pity, but from the recognition of how far she'd fallen from the person she'd once thought herself to be. You're right, she said, and I'm ashamed of that. I'm ashamed that it took public humiliation for me to see what I'd become. They sat in silence for a few minutes, watching the town come to life around them. A delivery truck rumbled past, and someone called out a greeting to Jack, who raised his hand in response. It was the kind of easy familiarity that spoke of deep community roots, something Vivienne had never experienced, despite living in the same city for most of her life. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Why did you leave teaching? I mean, I understand about your daughter, but you want to know why I chose this over lecturing undergraduates about Stoic philosophy." There was a hint of humor in his voice now, the first she'd heard from him. "Something like that." Jack was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then he stood and gestured for her to follow him. "Come on, I'll show you." He led her around the back of the shop to a work area she hadn't noticed before. Under a makeshift canopy sat a motorcycle in various stages of restoration, a vintage Triumph, probably from the late 60s, stripped down to its essential components. Every part was laid out with careful precision, cleaned and catalogued like archaeological artifacts. "I started this project about 3 years ago," Jack explained, running his hand along the fuel tank. "Found her in a barn outside town, rusted and forgotten. Previous owner said she'd been sitting there for 40 years, ever since his son went to Vietnam and never came back." Vivienne studied the bike, beginning to understand. "You're bringing it back to life." "I'm trying to. It's slow work, have to fabricate some parts, hunt down others from collectors and specialty shops. Could take me another 2 years to finish, maybe longer." He picked up a carburetor component, examining it in the light. "When I was teaching, I spent my days talking about ideas, theories, the meaning of ancient texts. Important work, don't get me wrong, but abstract. When Sophia got sick," he paused, setting the part down carefully, "I realized I needed something concrete, something I could actually fix." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Vivienne thought about her own world of quarterly reports and market projections, the endless meetings about strategies and initiatives that sometimes felt disconnected from any tangible result. "Does it help?" she asked. "The concrete work?" "Some days. It's honest work, you put effort in, you get results out. Engine runs or it doesn't. No ambiguity, no interpretation required." He smiled slightly. "Though I have to admit, yesterday was the first time in 12 years I missed the classroom. Felt good to use that Latin for something other than reading Seneca by myself on Saturday nights." They walked back toward the front of the shop, and Vivienne found herself noticing things she'd missed the day before: the hand-painted sign advertising fair prices, the clean organization of tools and parts, the evidence of work done with care and attention to detail. "Your car should be ready in about an hour," Jack said as they reached the office. "Fuel line was clogged, nothing too serious. Won't charge you for the diagnostic. Seems like we both learned something yesterday." "I'd like to pay full price," Vivienne said quickly. "And I was wondering, would you be willing to have dinner with me?" "Not a date," she added hastily, seeing his expression. "Just, I'd like to hear more about your work. Both kinds of work. I think I could learn something." Jack studied her face, and she had the feeling he was seeing past the expensive clothes and careful makeup to something more essential. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. "There's a place called Rosie's about 3 blocks down Main Street. Nothing fancy, but the food's good and honest. 7 o'clock? Perfect." She paused at her car door. "And Jack, thank you for giving me a chance to apologize properly. I know you didn't have to." "Everyone deserves a chance to make things right," he said. "Sophia taught me that, among other things." As Vivienne drove back toward the city, she found herself thinking not about the merger she was supposed to be analyzing or the board meeting she was missing, but about a man who'd chosen to rebuild motorcycles instead of careers, who'd found wisdom in honest work and the patience to restore beauty from rust and neglect. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to a conversation that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with understanding how someone else chose to live their life. Rosie's diner occupied a corner building that looked like it had been serving comfort food since the Eisenhower administration. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a jukebox that actually worked. It was the kind of place that existed in every small town in America, unchanged by trends or gentrification. Vivienne felt conspicuously overdressed in her business attire, but the hostess, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and sensible shoes, greeted her warmly. "You must be Jack's friend," she said, leading Vivienne to a booth in the back corner. "He said you might be stopping by. I'm Rosie, by the way. Been feeding this town for 37 years. Jack arrived precisely at 7, wearing clean jeans and a button-down shirt that looked like it had been pressed. His hair was loose, still damp from a recent shower, and without the work clothes and grease stains, Vivienne could see even more clearly the man he'd been before, the professor who'd commanded lecture halls and published papers on classical rhetoric. "You found it okay," he said, sliding into the booth across from her. "Hard to miss. Rosie says you're a regular." Guilty as charged. After 12 years of my own cooking, I've learned to appreciate someone who actually knows what they're doing in a kitchen. He accepted a menu from Rosie, though it was clear he didn't need it. "The meatloaf is excellent, if you're interested in honest food." They ordered meatloaf for him, a chicken sandwich for her, and settled into the careful conversation of two people who were still figuring out what they might have in common beyond their spectacular first meeting. "Can I ask you something?" Vivienne said after their food arrived. "Do you miss it? Teaching, I mean." Jack cut into his meatloaf, considering the question. "I miss parts of it. The moment when a student finally understands something they've been struggling with, that look of recognition, like pieces clicking into place. I miss the discussions, the way ancient texts could suddenly become relevant to contemporary problems." He paused. "But I don't miss the politics, the publish or perish pressure, the committee meetings that lasted 3 hours and accomplished nothing. It sounds like you were good at it." "I thought I was. Had good student evaluations, got tenure track faster than most. But," he set down his fork, "when Sophia got sick, I realized how little any of it mattered. All those papers I'd written about Stoic philosophy, about accepting what you cannot change and focusing on what you can control, turned out I didn't believe a word of it when it came to my own life." Vivienne heard the pain beneath the words, still fresh after all these years. How old was she when she died? 14. 3 years of treatments, remissions, relapses. By the end, she weighed 68 pounds and could still make me laugh. His voice was steady, but she could see the effort it took. She spent her last week reading Virgil, in Latin. Said she wanted to understand what Daddy taught before He stopped, unable to finish. The silence stretched between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss in its many forms. Finally, Vivienne spoke. "I've never had children, never seemed to find the time, or the right person, or..." She shrugged. "I told myself my work was enough, that building something lasting was its own kind of legacy. But listening to you talk about Sophia, I wonder if I've just been afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of loving something more than I love control, of having something in my life that couldn't be managed or optimized or fixed with better strategy." She smiled ruefully. "I run a multi-billion-dollar company, but the idea of being responsible for another person's happiness terrifies me." Jack studied her across the table. "What made you become a CEO? I mean, was it always the plan?" "I inherited the company when my father died. Heart attack at 59, the stress finally caught up with him. I was supposed to be a transitional leader, keep things stable until the board could find a more suitable replacement." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "That was 8 years ago. Sounds like you proved them wrong." "I proved I could do the job. Whether I should have is a different question." She pushed food around her plate, thinking, "I've spent 8 years fighting to be taken seriously, to prove I belonged in that chair. Somewhere along the way, I think I forgot who I was outside of that role." They talked until the diner started to empty, their conversation ranging from philosophy to literature to the peculiar satisfactions of manual labor. Jack told her about the garden behind his house, how he'd learned to grow tomatoes from an elderly neighbor who'd taken pity on his early attempts. Vivienne found herself describing the view from her penthouse windows, how the city looked different at different times of day but always felt somehow distant. "Would you like to see the garden?" Jack asked as they prepared to leave. "It's not far, and the evening light is particularly good this time of year." They walked the 6 blocks to Maple Street in comfortable silence, past houses with front porches and established trees, where children played in yards and neighbors called greetings from across the street. It was a different kind of wealth than Vivienne was accustomed to, the wealth of community, of belonging somewhere. Jack's house was modest but well-maintained, a 1920s craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and flower boxes under the windows. But the real revelation was the backyard, a quarter-acre transformed into something that was equal parts productive garden and artistic sanctuary. Rows of vegetables grew in neat lines, tomatoes heavy with fruit, peppers in various stages of ripeness, herbs that filled the air with fragrance. But there were flowers too, roses climbing a wooden arbor, lavender that hummed with bees, morning glories that had claimed an entire section of fence. In the far corner, partially hidden by a trellis, sat the motorcycle she'd seen at the shop. "This is beautiful," Vivienne said, meaning it. "How long did this take?" 12 years of trial and error. First few seasons were disasters, killed more plants than I kept alive. But Mrs. Patterson next door took pity on me and started sharing her wisdom." He gestured toward the house next door, where an elderly woman was visible through the kitchen window. "She's 86, been gardening for 70 years, taught me that patience is the most important skill you can develop." They walked among the plants as the sun set, Jack pointing out varieties and sharing stories of particular successes and failures. There was something meditative about the space, a sense of time moving at a different pace than the relentless urgency that characterized Vivienne's daily life. "I used to think this kind of life was—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Boring? Limited? Beneath your ambitions?" There was no judgment in his voice, just gentle understanding. "All of those things, if I'm being honest. I thought happiness had to be earned through achievement, through proving yourself against increasingly difficult challenges. The idea of finding satisfaction in something so simple seemed simplistic." "Exactly. But being here, seeing what you've built." She turned to face him in the gathering dusk. "There's wisdom in this that I never considered. Purpose that doesn't require validation from anyone else." Jack moved closer, and she could smell the lingering scent of soap and something distinctly masculine that made her aware of him in ways that had nothing to do with conversation. "Vivienne," he said quietly, "I need you to know that this tonight, showing you this place, it's not something I do. I haven't had anyone over for dinner in 12 years. Why me?" "Why now?" "Because yesterday, when you corrected my grammar, I saw someone who was scared and trying to maintain control in a situation where she had none. I recognized it because I've been there, the desperation to prove you belong, to demonstrate your worth through intellectual superiority." He reached out and gently touched her hand. "And because when you came back today with coffee and a handwritten apology, I saw someone brave enough to face her own mistakes." The touch of his hand was electric, sending warmth up her arm and making her suddenly aware of how long it had been since anyone had touched her with genuine affection, rather than calculated networking. She looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from years of honest work, hers soft and manicured, bearing only the thin line of an expensive watch. "I should probably go," she said, though she made no move to pull away. "It's getting late, and you probably have an early morning." "I do, but I'm not ready for this evening to end." He stepped closer, and she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the way the setting sun caught the silver in his hair. "Vivienne, I haven't felt this connected to another person in a very long time." Before she could overthink it, before the rational part of her mind could catalogue all the reasons this was complicated, she rose on her toes and kissed him. It was gentle at first, tentative, but when he responded by pulling her closer, she felt something inside her chest crack open, some long frozen part of herself that had been waiting for exactly this kind of warmth. When they broke apart, both breathing slightly harder, she rested her forehead against his chest and felt his heart beating beneath her cheek. It was steady, reassuring, real in a way that nothing in her corporate world had been for years. "This is complicated," she whispered. "Yes," he agreed, his arms still around her. "But not tonight. Tonight, it's just two people who found something unexpected." She stayed in his arms for a few more moments, surrounded by the scent of flowers and herbs, listening to the distant sound of children being called in for bedtime and dogs barking friendly warnings to strangers passing by. It was a kind of peace she'd never experienced, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with achievement or status. Finally, reluctantly, she pulled away. "I really should go, but Jack, thank you. For dinner, for showing me this. She gestured helplessly, unable to articulate what the evening had meant. "Thank you for coming back," he said simply, "for being brave enough to try again." As she drove home through the darkening countryside, Vivienne caught herself smiling in a way she hadn't in years. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her assistant, updates on stock prices, requests for decisions that couldn't wait until morning. But for once, the urgency felt artificial, manufactured. The real world was a man with dirt under his fingernails who could quote Cicero and grow tomatoes with equal skill, who'd shown her that there were kinds of success that couldn't be measured in quarterly reports. Back in the garden, Jack stood among his plants and looked up at the stars, just beginning to appear in the clear country sky. For the first time since Sophia's death, he'd allowed himself to feel something other than grief, hope, possibility, the stirring of emotions he'd thought were buried with his daughter. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unexpected, this connection with a woman whose world was so different from his own. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text message. From Vivienne, "Thank you for a perfect evening. Sleep well among your flowers." He smiled and typed back, "Thank you for seeing beauty in simple things. Drive safely." Neither of them slept particularly well that night, both replaying the evening's conversations and wondering what it might mean for the carefully ordered lives they'd built from the ruins of their different losses. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 in the morning, which meant Vivienne had exactly 3 hours of sleep before facing questions about her recent erratic behavior. She sat at the head of the mahogany conference table, surrounded by 12 men and 2 women who represented old money, older connections, and the collective belief that leadership should be predictable above all else. "The video has been viewed over 12 million times, announced Richard Pemberton, the board's senior member and her father's former business partner. "Our stock price has recovered, but the commentary about Langley Industries' leadership continues to circulate. Some of it is quite unflattering." Vivienne studied the portfolio of printed screenshots and social media analytics that had been distributed. The memes were creative. She had to admit her expression of shock as Jack delivered his Latin quotation had been transformed into commentary on everything from corporate arrogance to the education system's failures. "I'm aware of the situation," she said calmly, "and I've taken steps to address it personally." Personally, Margaret Whitfield, the board's marketing specialist, leaned forward. "Vivienne, this requires professional crisis management. We need coordinated messaging, strategic responses, perhaps a charitable contribution to education initiatives." "What I need," Vivienne interrupted, "is for this board to trust that I can handle a situation that involves my personal conduct without turning it into a corporate strategy session." The silence that followed was pointed. Pemberton cleared his throat. "Of course, we trust your judgment. But as your advisors, we feel obligated to point out that your personal conduct has become a matter of public interest. The business world is watching how you handle this." "The business world," Vivienne repeated slowly. is watching a grown woman learn that her assumptions about other people were both wrong and unkind. If that threatens our market position, perhaps we need to examine what we're really selling. She could see the concerned glances exchanged around the table. This was not the Vivienne they knew, the woman who had built her reputation on ruthless efficiency and unshakable composure. This version, who spoke about personal growth and questioned fundamental business principles, was unpredictable. And in corporate America, unpredictability was dangerous. The meeting dragged on for another hour, covering quarterly projections and strategic initiatives that felt increasingly abstract to Vivienne. When it finally ended, she escaped to her office and called Monica. "Clear my schedule for Friday afternoon," she said, "and see if you can find out what time Murphy's Auto Shop closes." "Ma'am?" Monica's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who suspected her boss might be having some kind of breakdown. "I'm going back to Cedar Falls. There's something I need to understand." That Friday, Vivienne arrived at the shop during what appeared to be Jack's lunch break. She found him in the small office, eating a sandwich while reading a paperback book, Marcus Aurelius, she noted with a smile. He looked up when she knocked on the doorframe. "Twice in 1 week," he said, marking his place in the book. "People will start to talk. They're already talking. Might as well give them something interesting to discuss." She gestured toward the book. "Meditations?" Seemed appropriate. Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. He closed the book and studied her face. "You look tired." "Board meeting this morning. Apparently, my recent behavior is concerning to stakeholders." She settled into the chair across from his desk. "Jack, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret giving up your old life? The prestige, the intellectual community, the sense that your work mattered on a larger scale." He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I regret that Sophia never got to see the kind of man I became after I stopped trying to impress other people. But no, I don't regret the choice itself. This life, working with my hands, being part of this community, growing things instead of just analyzing them, it's more honest than anything I did in academia." "More honest how?" "When I fix someone's car, I know immediately whether I've succeeded or failed. When Mrs. Patterson's tomatoes grow better because I helped her with her soil, I can see the results. When I teach Tyler how to rebuild a carburetor, I'm passing on something concrete, something useful." He leaned back in his chair. "In academia, I spent years writing papers that maybe a dozen people would read, arguing about interpretations of texts that were already thousands of years old. Important work, but abstract, removed from daily life." Vivienne thought about her own work, the deals and strategies that moved numbers around on financial statements but rarely touched the lives of actual people. "My father built the company from nothing, started with a single construction contract and grew it into what it is today. But somewhere along the way, it became about the growth itself rather than what we were building." "What would you build if you could start over?" The question caught her off guard. She'd spent so many years focused on maintaining and expanding what her father had created that she'd never considered what she might want to build herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "Something that mattered. Something that made people's lives better in ways they could see and feel." They were interrupted by the arrival of Tyler, the young man who'd recorded their initial confrontation. He looked embarrassed when he saw Vivienne, clearly remembering his role in making their encounter public. "Hey, Jack. Sorry to interrupt. Just wanted to drop off Mrs. Chen's keys. Her transmission is ready." He glanced at Vivienne, uncertainly. "And, I wanted to say I'm sorry about the video thing. I didn't think about how it might affect you." "It's okay," Vivienne said, surprising herself by meaning it. "Actually, it helped me see something about myself that I needed to see. Sometimes we need external perspectives to recognize our own blind spots." Tyler brightened. "That's what Jack always says, that the best teachers are usually the ones who make us uncomfortable." After Tyler left, Jack looked at her with something that might have been pride. "That was gracious of you." "I'm trying to learn. From you, actually." She stood to leave. "Jack, would you be interested in having dinner again? Maybe tomorrow night? I promise no more corporate drama or existential crises." "I'd like that. But Vivienne," he stood as well, moving closer. "I need you to know that this, whatever this is between us, it's not casual for me. I haven't opened myself up to someone new since Elena died. If you're looking for a distraction or a break from your real life, I need to know now." The directness of the question, the vulnerability in his voice, made her chest tighten. "It's not casual for me either. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's not casual." He nodded, seeming satisfied with her answer. "Tomorrow, then. But this time, let me cook for you. There's something to be said for a meal prepared with your own hands." As Vivienne drove back to the city, she found herself thinking about the corporate merger documents sitting on her desk, the quarterly projections that demanded her attention, the strategic planning sessions scheduled for Monday morning. All of it felt increasingly like elaborate games played by people who had forgotten what they were ultimately trying to accomplish. Her phone rang Monica, with updates and urgent requests for decisions, but for the first time in her career, Vivienne let it go to voicemail. Tomorrow evening, she would sit in Jack's kitchen and eat food he'd prepared himself, and they would talk about books and gardens and the peculiar satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. It seemed, suddenly, like the most important meeting on her calendar. The dinner was supposed to be simple: Jack's homemade pasta with vegetables from his garden, wine from a local vineyard, conversation that had nothing to do with corporate strategies or academic theories. But as Vivienne helped him prepare the meal, she noticed things that hadn't registered before: the careful way he moved around the kitchen, the efficiency that spoke of long practice, the small details that suggested he'd once cooked for more than just himself. "You're very good at this," she observed, watching him julienne carrots with professional precision. "I had a good teacher," he said, then paused, his knife suspended mid-cut. "Sophia loved to cook, started when she was 8, right after Elena died. Said someone had to take care of Daddy, make sure he ate real food instead of cereal for dinner." He continued cutting, but Vivienne could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he mentioned his daughter. She'd learned to recognize the signs, the moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly, demanding attention. "She must have been an amazing kid," Vivienne said softly. "She was. Stubborn, brilliant, funny as hell. Used to leave me notes in Latin. When she wanted something figured, I couldn't say no if she asked in a dead language." He smiled, but it was edged with pain. "The last year, when the chemo made her too weak to cook, she'd sit at this table and boss me around, make sure I didn't ruin her recipes." They ate at the small table by the window, surrounded by the evening sounds of the neighborhood children playing, lawn mowers, the distant sound of a baseball game on someone's radio. It was peaceful in a way that Vivienne's penthouse never was, despite its designer furniture and million-dollar view. "Jack," she said carefully, "can I ask what happened with the university, I mean? Monica, my assistant, said you left mid-semester, but the records don't show any kind of scandal or controversy." Jack set down his fork and was quiet for so long that Vivienne thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but distant, as if he were recounting someone else's story. "Sophia was diagnosed when she was 11, acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The doctors said the survival rates were good, especially for children, but it meant 2 years of intensive treatment. Chemotherapy, radiation, bone marrow transplants." He stared out the window at his garden. "I tried to keep teaching at first. Hired babysitters, arranged my schedule around hospital visits, graded papers in the pediatric oncology waiting room." Vivienne found herself holding her breath, sensing they were approaching something crucial. But the treatments were brutal. She'd be sick for days after each round of chemo, and when she felt good enough to go to school, she was so far behind that I ended up homeschooling her. Meanwhile, I'm supposed to be researching and writing, attending faculty meetings, pretending that debates about curriculum changes matter when my daughter is fighting for her life." He stood abruptly and moved to the kitchen window, his back to her. The university was understanding at first. Compassionate leave, reduced course load, colleagues covering my classes. But after a year, there were questions about my research productivity, my commitment to the department. I remember one faculty meeting where the department head suggested I consider whether I was truly present for my students. The bitterness in his voice made Vivienne's chest tighten. She'd heard similar conversations in corporate settings, the subtle pressure to prove dedication, the implication that personal problems were professional weaknesses. I quit that night, walked out of the meeting, went home, and typed my resignation letter. Sophia was in remission then, doing well back in school and making plans for high school. She was furious with me for leaving. Furious. Jack turned back to face her, and she could see the old pain in his eyes. She said I'd given up my dreams because of her, that I was using her illness as an excuse to run away from something I'd stopped loving. 13 years old, and she could see through me better than I could see through myself. What did she mean? That I'd been questioning academic life long before she got sick. The politics, the pressure to publish constantly, the way the ivory tower seemed increasingly disconnected from real life. Sophia's illness just gave me permission to admit what I'd been feeling for years, that I wanted something more concrete, more immediate, more honest. He returned to the table but didn't sit down. Instead, he walked to a small bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a folder. She died 6 months later. The cancer came back, aggressive and resistant to treatment. By the end, she weighed 68 pounds and could barely lift her head, but she was still reading. Still learning. He opened the folder and pulled out a letter, handwritten in a careful script that looked young but determined. She wrote this 3 days before she died. I found it on my desk after. His voice broke slightly. After the funeral. Vivienne accepted the letter with trembling hands. The paper was cream-colored, good quality, and the handwriting was precise despite obvious weakness. Daddy, I know you think you failed me by leaving the university, but you didn't. You gave me something better than academic success. You gave me a father who was present, who put family above career, who showed me that love means being willing to sacrifice for the people you care about. I'm not going to get better this time. We both know it, even though the doctors keep talking about experimental treatments and miracle cures. But I'm not afraid, because you taught me to be brave not with words from dead Romans, but with your actions. I want you to know that the happiest year of my life was this last one, when you were home every day, when we cooked together and read together and talked about everything except cancer. You gave me a gift more precious than all the academic honors in the world. You gave me your undivided attention when I needed it most. Don't go back to the university, Daddy. Find work that makes you happy, that lets you help people in immediate, tangible ways. Fix things that are broken. Build things that last. Be the man you became when you stopped trying to impress strangers and started focusing on what really matters. I love you more than Cicero loved Rome. Your devoted daughter, Sophia Elena Reyes. P.S. Please don't spend the rest of your life being sad. I want you to fall in love again, to laugh again, to find joy in simple things. Promise me. By the time Vivienne finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She looked up to find Jack watching her, his own eyes wet but steady. She was 14 years old, he said quietly. 14, and wiser than any philosophy professor I'd ever met. Vivienne carefully folded the letter and handed it back. Jack, I'm so sorry. I had no idea the depth of your sacrifice, what you gave up for her. I didn't give up anything, he said firmly. I chose love over ambition, presence over prestige. It was the easiest decision I ever made, and the best. The only thing I regret is that she didn't live to see what came next, this life, this community, this sense of peace that I never had when I was trying to climb the academic ladder. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of Sophia's wisdom settling between them. Finally, Vivienne spoke. She would have liked seeing you happy, wouldn't she? Seeing you with someone who cares about you? I think so. She was always worried about me being alone, even when she was the one who was sick. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Vivienne, I need you to understand I'm not looking for someone to save me from my grief or fix what's broken in my life. I'm looking for someone to share the life I've built from that brokenness. And I'm not looking for someone to rescue me from my corporate prison or teach me how to be a better person," she replied. "I'm looking for someone who sees who I really am underneath all the armor I've built and cares about me anyway." They moved to the living room after dinner, sitting on his old couch with books scattered on every surface, and Sophia's artwork still hanging on the walls, drawings and paintings that showed a child's perspective on beauty, humor, and hope in the face of impossible circumstances. "Tell me about her art," Vivienne said, studying a watercolor of the garden in full bloom. She painted what she wanted to see the world as it could be, full of color and life and possibility. Even when she was sick, even when she was scared, she painted beautiful things. He pointed to a small canvas near the window. That one she finished the week before she died. Said it was her vision of heaven, not clouds and harps, but a garden where nothing ever stopped growing. The painting showed an impossible garden, where flowers bloomed in every season simultaneously, where fruit trees bore their harvest year-round, where butterflies and hummingbirds filled the air with motion and color. It was the work of someone who understood that beauty was not about perfection, but about abundance, generosity, the willingness to believe in renewal, even in the face of loss. She sounds like she was extraordinary. She was. But more than that, she was real, honest in ways that most adults never manage to be. She faced death with more grace than I've ever seen anyone face anything, and she did it while worried about whether I was eating enough vegetables. As the evening grew late, they found themselves talking about everything and nothing, books they'd loved, places they'd wanted to travel, small embarrassments from childhood that still made them laugh. It was the kind of conversation that Vivienne hadn't had in years, free from agenda or strategy, focused simply on the pleasure of understanding another person better. When she finally prepared to leave, Jack walked her to her car, and they stood in the pool of light from his front porch, reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for sharing Sophia with me," she said, "for trusting me with her story. Thank you for listening, for seeing her as the remarkable person she was, not just as my tragedy." He cupped her face gently. "Vivienne, I know this is complicated, our different worlds, the scrutiny you're facing, the fact that I'm a man with more emotional baggage than anyone should reasonably take on. We all have baggage," she said, leaning into his touch. "The question is whether we're willing to help each other carry it." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and for the first time since Sophia's death, Jack felt the truth of his daughter's final wish, that he might find joy again, that he might choose love over safety, that he might build something beautiful from the foundation of all he'd learned about what truly mattered. As Vivienne drove home, she thought about the letter, about a 14-year-old girl who'd understood something about life that most adults never learned, that love was not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to be present for someone real. And for the first time in her adult life, she felt ready to make that choice. The ultimatum came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the cold precision that Vivienne had once admired in board communications. She sat in her office, reading the formal letter that had been hand-delivered by Margaret Whitfield, while her coffee grew cold and her assistant fielded increasingly urgent calls from reporters who had somehow gotten wind of internal company tensions. "The board feels that your recent behavior patterns indicate a concerning shift in priorities," Whitfield had explained, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering a prepared statement. "The Cedar Falls incident, while initially damaging, might have been contained if handled properly. However, your subsequent visits to the area, combined with your apparent disengagement from critical business decisions, suggest a fundamental misalignment with the company's strategic direction." The letter was more direct. Vivienne had 30 days to demonstrate renewed commitment to her role as CEO, including severing any personal relationships that might compromise her professional judgment, or the board would initiate proceedings to remove her from leadership. They'd even helpfully attached a succession plan that positioned Richard Pemberton as interim CEO. "They can't do this," Monica said, pacing in front of Vivienne's desk with the agitation of someone whose own job security was tied to her boss's. "You've tripled the company's market value in 8 years. The stock price is at an all-time high. They can't fire you for having a personal life. They can if they can prove I'm not fulfilling my fiduciary responsibilities," Vivienne replied, studying the legal language that would essentially force her to choose between the company her father had built and the first genuine relationship she'd had in decades. "And they've been building a case, missed meetings, delayed decisions, what they're calling erratic behavior patterns." Her phone buzzed with a text from Jack. "Dinner tonight? I'm making that pasta you liked, and I found a bottle of wine that might actually be worthy of your sophisticated palate." The casual affection in his message, the assumption that she would of course want to spend the evening with him, made her throat tighten. How could she explain that her world was constructed in such a way that caring about someone outside the corporate ecosystem was considered a liability? "Ma'am?" Monica was watching her carefully. "What do you want me to tell the reporters? And the board is expecting a response by Friday." Vivienne set down the letter and looked out at the city skyline, thinking about a garden in Cedar Falls where a man grew tomatoes and restored motorcycles and had shown her that success could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. "Tell the reporters no comment, and schedule a meeting with my lawyer for tomorrow morning," she turned back to Monica, "and clear my schedule for tonight. I need to drive to Cedar Falls." The conversation with Jack took place in his garden, under a sky that threatened rain but held off long enough for them to walk among the late summer vegetables. She'd driven straight from the office, still wearing her business suit, feeling overdressed and out of place among the bean poles and tomato stakes. "They're asking you to choose," Jack said after she'd explained the situation. It wasn't a question. Essentially, yes, between the company and, she gestured helplessly between them. "Between the life you've known and the life you might want." He bent to pick a handful of cherry tomatoes, offering her one. "What are you going to do?" The tomato was warm from the sun, sweet and tart, and alive in a way that reminded her of everything she'd been missing in her climate-controlled, artificially preserved existence. "I don't know. This company isn't just my career, Jack. It's my father's legacy, the thing he spent his entire adult life building. If I walk away, you're not responsible for preserving your father's legacy at the expense of your own happiness," he said gently. "Trust me, I know something about the weight of other people's expectations." They sat on the wooden bench he'd built near the back fence, surrounded by the evening sounds of a neighborhood settling into dinner routines and homework sessions. It was peaceful in a way that made Vivienne's corporate world seem not just stressful but artificial, an elaborate game played by people who had forgotten what they were ultimately trying to accomplish. "Tell me about the succession plan," Jack said. "If you stepped back, what would happen to the company?" "Pemberton would take over initially. He's competent, conservative, probably wouldn't make any dramatic changes. The company would continue to be profitable, maybe not as aggressively growth-oriented as it's been under my leadership, but stable." She laughed bitterly. "In some ways, it might be better for everyone. Less pressure, less risk-taking, more predictable returns. But it would mean admitting that they were right, that a woman can't handle the demands of leadership, that personal relationships are incompatible with professional success, that I'm not strong enough to do what my father did." The words tasted like failure in her mouth. Jack was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Can I tell you what I think Sophia would say? If she were here?" Vivienne nodded, curious about this perspective from a 14-year-old who had somehow understood life better than most adults. "She'd ask you what kind of success you want to be remembered for. The kind that impresses strangers, or the kind that makes you proud of who you became." He turned to face her fully. "And she'd probably point out that your father built a company, but you've built a life. Both are valuable, but only one of them requires your personal happiness as collateral. It's not that simple, though. If I choose you, choose this life, I'm walking away from everything I've worked for. I'm 42 years old, Jack. If I give up my position now, I'll never get another opportunity like it. Would you want another opportunity like it? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not judgment. Vivienne considered this, really considered it, perhaps for the first time in her adult life. A year ago, I would have said absolutely. Power, influence, the ability to shape markets and drive innovation, it was intoxicating. But lately, she paused, searching for words. Lately, it feels like I'm playing a game whose rules I never questioned, competing for prizes I'm not sure I actually want. What would you want to do instead? I don't know. Something that matters to actual people. Something I could see the results of, like your work here. She gestured toward the garden. Maybe consulting for smaller companies, helping them grow sustainably instead of just maximizing shareholder value. Maybe teaching business ethics, showing young entrepreneurs that success doesn't have to mean sacrificing everything else. As she spoke, she could hear the excitement in her own voice, the energy that came from imagining work that aligned with her values rather than contradicting them. It was the first time in years that she'd thought about her career in terms of what she wanted to contribute rather than what she wanted to achieve. The first raindrops began to fall as they walked back toward the house, fat drops that smelled of earth and growing things. They stood on the porch, watching the garden drink in the sudden shower, and Vivienne felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of clarity she hadn't experienced since her father's death. "Jack," she said quietly, "if I choose this, choose you, choose a different kind of life, I need you to know that it's not because I'm running away from something. It's because I'm running towards something I never knew I wanted." He pulled her closer, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing, the solid reality of a man who had already learned how to rebuild his life from loss and disappointment. "And I need you to know that if you choose your company, choose the life you've built there, I'll understand. I won't like it, but I'll understand. Sometimes the obligations we've accepted are bigger than our personal desires." But even as he said it, she could see in his eyes that he was hoping she would choose differently, hoping she would be brave enough to bet on something new and uncertain and beautiful. "I have until Friday to give them an answer," she said. "Then we have until Friday to be sure." He kissed her forehead gently. "Whatever you decide, Vivienne, make sure it's a choice you can live with for the next 40 years. Because that's what we're really talking about, not just your next career move, but the shape of your entire remaining life." As she drove home through the rain, Vivienne found herself thinking not about quarterly projections or board dynamics, but about the way Jack moved through his garden with such obvious contentment, the satisfaction in his voice when he talked about helping his neighbors, the peace in his eyes when he spoke about his daughter. It was a different kind of success than anything she'd ever known, measured not in market share or profit margins, but in the daily choice to build something meaningful from whatever materials life provided. Her phone buzzed with messages from board members, investors, reporters seeking statements about rumors of internal conflict, but for the first time in her professional life, she let them all go unanswered. Friday would come soon enough, and with it the choice that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life trying to prove herself worthy of other people's approval or building something worthy of her own respect. In the distance, she could see the lights of the city, where she'd made her fortune and reputation, where boardrooms full of powerful people were probably discussing her future, as if she weren't the one who got to decide it. But behind her, growing smaller in the rearview mirror, was a small town where a man with calloused hands and a broken heart had shown her that wisdom often came disguised as simple choices made with courage and love. The boardroom had never felt more like a courtroom than it did on Friday morning. Vivienne sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, facing 12 of the most powerful people in American business, each holding a portfolio containing stock certificates, succession plans, and legal documents that would effectively end her career if she refused to comply with their demands. Richard Pemberton, impeccable in his Savile Row suit and Princeton tie, cleared his throat and began what was clearly a prepared statement. "Vivienne, we want you to know that this gives us no pleasure. Your father was not just my business partner, but my closest friend, and watching you grow, this company has been one of the great privileges of my career." "But," Vivienne prompted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system, "but leadership requires unwavering focus, especially in today's volatile market. The incident in Cedar Falls, while regrettable, might have been contained if handled with appropriate corporate messaging. Instead, you've chosen to pursue a personal relationship that has become a distraction from your fiduciary responsibilities." Margaret Whitfield leaned forward, her expression carefully sympathetic. "We've documented 17 missed meetings in the past month, delayed responses to time-sensitive acquisition opportunities, and what can only be described as a fundamental shift in your decision-making priorities." Vivienne looked around the table at faces. She'd known for years people who had celebrated her successes, supported her through the difficult transition after her father's death, and now sat in judgment of her personal choices as if they were criminal offenses. "Let me understand this correctly," she said, her tone controlled but sharp. "You're threatening to remove me as CEO because I've been spending time with someone who makes me happy?" "We're concerned about your judgment," Pemberton replied. "This mechanic, Dr. Reyes," Vivienne corrected firmly. "His name is Dr. Jackson Reyes, and he holds a doctorate in classical studies from Northwestern University." The slight shift in the room's energy was palpable. Several board members exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this piece of information. "Regardless of his credentials," Whitfield continued, "your relationship with him has become a liability. The media attention, the questions about your stability, the impact on company morale." "Company morale?" Vivienne felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. "Our employees are concerned about my dating life? They're concerned about leadership that appears erratic, unfocused." "Erratic." Vivienne stood slowly, her hands flat on the table. "Unfocused. Interesting choice of words. Would you use the same language to describe a male CEO who fell in love? Would we be having this conversation if I were a man who'd found someone who challenged him to examine his life more deeply?" The silence that followed was telling. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Vivienne could see the recognition in several faces around the table, the dawning awareness that their objections might have less to do with her performance and more to do with their assumptions about how women in power were supposed to behave. "This isn't about gender," Pemberton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it? Because I've been thinking about this all week, and I can't recall a single instance where this board questioned a male executive's priorities because he got married, had children, or fell in love. But apparently, when I dare to have a personal life that brings me joy, it's evidence of compromised judgment." She walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where thousands of people were making their own choices about what constituted a successful life. "You want to know about my judgment? Here's what I've learned in the past month. I've been so focused on proving I belonged in this room that I forgot to ask myself whether I actually wanted to be here." "Vivienne," Pemberton began, but she held up a hand. "I'm not finished. For 8 years, I've given this company everything: my time, my energy, my health, my personal relationships. I've made decisions that increased shareholder value while keeping employees I've never met, attending dinners with people I don't respect, and measuring my worth by metrics that have nothing to do with the kind of person I want to be." She turned back to face them, and for the first time since entering the room, she felt completely calm. "You're right about one thing: my priorities have shifted. I've met someone who's shown me that there are different ways to measure success, different ways to contribute to the world. And yes, that's affecting how I think about this job. Then you understand our position, Whitfield said, her voice carefully neutral. I understand that you're terrified of any change that threatens your control, Vivienne replied. You're not concerned about my performance, you're concerned about my independence, about the possibility that I might start making decisions based on my own values rather than your expectations. The tension in the room was palpable now, years of unspoken dynamics finally brought into the light. These were people who had watched her fight for respect in a world that questioned her right to lead, and now they were using that same dynamic to control her personal choices. So here's my decision, Vivienne continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations as CEO, effective immediately. The collective intake of breath around the table was audible. Several board members began speaking at once, but Vivienne held up her hand for silence. I'm not abandoning the company, she continued, her voice carrying the authority that had made her successful in the first place. I'm restructuring my role. I'll remain as chairman of the board and maintain my controlling interest in company stock. Richard, you'll assume the role of CEO, as you've clearly been planning. Pemberton's expression shifted from satisfaction to uncertainty. Vivienne, if this is about the ultimatum, perhaps we can discuss alternative arrangements. This isn't about your ultimatum, this is about my choice. She moved back to her seat, but remained standing. I'm also announcing the creation of the Langley Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on supporting small businesses and educational initiatives in underserved communities. The foundation will be funded by my personal assets and will operate independently of Langley Industries. The legal implications of what she was proposing began to dawn on the faces around the table. By maintaining her stock position while stepping back from operations, she would retain significant influence over major decisions while freeing herself from the daily demands that had consumed her life. You can't be serious, Margaret Whitfield said, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. You're walking away from one of the most powerful positions in American business. To what? Play house with a small-town mechanic? The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, and Vivienne felt something sharp and final settle in her chest. I'm walking away from a life that required me to justify my personal happiness to a room full of people who measure success by how much of yourself you're willing to sacrifice for their approval. She gathered the documents they'd prepared for her signature, the compliance agreements, the behavioral contracts, the formal submission to their demands, and placed them in the center of the table. I won't be signing these. Instead, my attorney will be in touch with details about the transition plan. Richard, you'll find my recommendations for key personnel changes in your office by end of business today, along with my assessment of ongoing projects and strategic initiatives. Vivienne, please, Pemberton said, standing as well. Don't make a decision you'll regret. This company is your legacy, your father's legacy. My father built this company to provide for his family and create something lasting. I'm honoring that legacy by choosing to build a life that reflects his values, not just his business model. She picked up her briefcase, feeling lighter with each step toward the door. The irony is that you've spent so much time trying to control my personal life that you've forgotten I'm still the largest single shareholder. I'll be very interested to see how you run things without my distraction. As she reached the door, she turned back one final time. Oh, and Margaret, Dr. Reyes isn't just a mechanic, but even if he were, he'd still be worth more than any of you, because he's never asked me to choose between loving him and respecting myself. The elevator ride to the parking garage felt like a descent into a new world. With each floor, Vivienne felt years of pressure and expectation falling away, replaced by something she hadn't experienced since her father's death, genuine excitement about the future. Her phone was already buzzing with calls from reporters, investors, and senior executives who'd somehow learned about the board meeting before she'd even left the building. But instead of the usual anxiety about message control and damage mitigation, she felt oddly peaceful. Let them speculate, analyze, criticize. She was done living her life as a public performance. The drive to Cedar Falls took exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes, through countryside that looked different now that she was seeing it as her future rather than her escape. She'd called ahead, asking Jack to meet her at Murphy's auto shop, and she found him waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck with an expression of carefully controlled hope. "How did it go?" he asked as she got out of her car. "I quit. Sort of. It's complicated." She moved into his arms, feeling the solid reality of his embrace ground her after the surreal morning in the boardroom. "I'm still a major shareholder, still involved in big-picture decisions, but I'm done with the day-to-day operations. How do you feel?" She considered the question, taking inventory of her emotional state. Terrified, exhilarated, free, like I just jumped off a cliff and discovered I could fly. Jack laughed, the sound rich and warm in the afternoon air. "That sounds about right. So what happens now? Now I figure out what I actually want to do with my life, instead of what other people expect me to do." She pulled back to look at him directly. "Jack, I need you to know this wasn't about choosing you over my career. This was about choosing myself over other people's definition of success." "I know," he said simply. "That's why I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and perfect and completely without artifice. It was the first time either of them had used the word love, but it felt as natural as breathing. "I love you too," she said, and meant it with every part of herself that had been waiting 42 years to understand what that really meant. They spent the rest of the afternoon walking through town, and Vivienne found herself seeing it through different eyes, not as a quaint escape from her real life, but as a community she might actually become part of. The hardware store owner who waved at Jack, the elderly woman who stopped to chat about her tomato plants, the teenagers working at the ice cream shop who treated him with easy familiarity. It was a kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in market capitalization. That evening, they sat in his garden as the sun set, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about practical things where she might live, how to structure the foundation, whether Murphy's auto shop could use someone with her business skills to help with expansion plans. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked as they watched the first stars appear. "I mean, really sure, because tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up in a world where you're no longer one of the most powerful executives in America, and I need to know you're not going to regret that." Vivienne thought about the question seriously, imagining the headlines that would greet her tomorrow, the analysis and speculation about her motivations, the inevitable criticism about choosing love over ambition, and she found that none of it frightened her the way it once would have. "I've spent 8 years trying to prove I deserved a life I didn't actually want," she said finally. "I'm ready to build a life I do want, even if other people don't understand it." Above them, the night sky stretched endless and clear, full of stars that had been there all along, waiting for someone to take the time to notice their beauty. And for the first time in her adult life, Vivienne felt like she had all the time in the world. 6 months later, Vivienne stood in the conference room of the Cedar Falls Community Center, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable during her corporate days. Local business owners, high school students, retired teachers, and young entrepreneurs filled the folding chairs, all gathered for the monthly workshop series she'd started through the Langley Foundation. "The most important lesson I learned in corporate leadership," she was saying, "is that sustainable success isn't about beating your competition. It's about understanding what value you actually create for real people. When you focus on that, the financial results follow naturally." In the back row, Jack sat with Murphy, both men wearing the slightly amazed expressions of people watching someone they loved thrive in ways they'd never imagined possible. After the workshop, a young woman approached with questions about funding for her bakery startup, and Vivienne found herself energized in ways that boardroom presentations had never managed to achieve. "That was impressive," Jack said as they walked home together, past houses where neighbors called out greetings and children played in yards illuminated by porch lights. "Mrs. Chen looked like she might actually take your advice about expanding her restaurant." I hope she does. She's got great instincts, just needs help with the financial planning. Vivienne adjusted the strap of the canvas bag she now carried instead of her old leather briefcase. You know what's funny? I'm working harder now than I ever did as CEO, but it doesn't feel like work. They'd found their rhythm over the winter months, Jack continuing his partnership with Murphy while gradually taking on more teaching responsibilities, helping high school students understand basic automotive maintenance and offering evening classes in small engine repair. Vivienne had rented a small office space above Henderson's Hardware, where she ran the foundation and provided consulting services to local businesses that couldn't afford traditional management firms. The house they were walking toward was Jack's, but it felt like home to Vivienne in ways her penthouse never had. She'd kept the city apartment for now, but used it mainly for occasional meetings with lawyers and accountants who helped manage her investments and foundation work. Most nights, she fell asleep to the sound of crickets and distant trains rather than traffic and sirens. "How are the wedding plans coming?" Jack asked, as they turned onto Maple Street. Vivienne smiled at the question that had become part of their evening routine. They'd gotten engaged at Christmas, a quiet proposal in the garden under a sky full of stars, with a ring that Jack had designed himself, a simple band, with a small diamond surrounded by tiny emeralds that reminded her of new growth in spring. "Rosie wants to cater. Mrs. Patterson insists on doing the flowers from her garden, and Tyler has appointed himself official photographer," she said. "I think we're going to have the most beautifully chaotic small-town wedding in Cedar Falls history." "And you're okay with that? No regrets about not having some elaborate corporate event?" It was a question he asked periodically, still sometimes incredulous that she'd chosen this life over the one that had once defined her. "Jack, a year ago I would have planned a wedding the way I planned acquisition strategies, maximum impact, perfect execution, designed to impress people I didn't actually care about. Now I get to marry the man I love in a garden tended by a woman who's become like a grandmother to me, surrounded by people who know us as we actually are. How could I regret that?" They settled onto the porch swing he'd built last spring, a piece of furniture that had become their favorite place for end-of-day conversations. The garden was coming alive, with early summer-growth tomatoes that promised abundant harvests, roses that climbed the arbor in defiant profusion, herbs that filled the evening air with fragrance. "I had an interesting conversation with Richard Pemberton today," Vivienne said, pulling out her phone to show Jack a text message. "Langley Industries wants to partner with the foundation on a rural economic development initiative." Jack read the message, his eyebrows raising slightly. "The same board that wanted to fire you for dating a mechanic now wants to work with you?" Turns out that stepping back from day-to-day operations while maintaining my equity stake was a brilliant strategic move, even if that wasn't my intention. She laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement rather than bitterness. "Richard's doing a competent job as CEO, but the board has realized they need my vision for long-term growth. And my foundation work has gotten enough positive attention that they want to be associated with it. How do you feel about that?" "Honestly, vindicated and amused. They spent so much energy trying to control my personal choices that they never considered I might be more valuable to them as an independent partner than as a controlled employee." The evening deepened around them, filled with the sounds of a community settling into night-distant laughter from a backyard barbecue, the rhythmic squeak of a screen door, someone practicing piano scales in a house across the street. It was the soundtrack of ordinary life, lived by ordinary people, and Vivienne had never been happier to be part of something so wonderfully unremarkable. "Can I tell you something?" Jack said, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Sophia would have loved you." It was something he said periodically, usually when Vivienne had done something that reminded him of his daughter's fierce independence or generous spirit. Tonight, it came after watching her patiently explain cash flow analysis to a teenager who wanted to start a lawn care business. "I would have loved her too," Vivienne replied, as she always did. "I wish I could have met her." In a way, You have. She's in everything good about this life. We're building the choice to value people over profit, the courage to define success on our own terms, the understanding that love is about presence, not performance. Above them, the stars emerged one by one in the clear country sky. The same stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and triumphs, countless people learning to choose love over fear, authenticity over approval. Vivienne thought about the viral video that had started this journey, how a moment of embarrassment had led to the most honest life she'd ever lived. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if my car hadn't broken down that day?" she asked. "Sometimes. But then I remember something Sophia used to say when she was sick, that the best things in life usually come disguised as problems we don't want to solve." He kissed the top of her head gently. "Maybe your car breaking down wasn't the problem. Maybe the problem was that you'd never learned to trust that you deserved to be happy." As they sat together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the garden they tended and the community they'd chosen to be part of, Vivienne felt the deep satisfaction that comes from aligning one's life with one's values. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, foundation work to oversee, wedding plans to finalize, the ongoing balance between her past success and her present happiness. But tonight, in this moment, she was exactly where she belonged, beside a man who'd taught her that true intelligence wasn't about proving your superiority to others, but about having the wisdom to recognize love when it appeared in your life, even if it came from the last place you'd thought to look. Sometimes the people we judge the harshest do indeed teach us the most about ourselves, and sometimes the voice of wisdom speaks Latin in a small-town auto shop, reminding us that the most important lessons are often the ones we never expected to learn. In the distance, a church bell chimed 10 o'clock, marking the end of another day in a life that measured its riches, not in market capitalization, but in moments of genuine connection, honest work, and the daily choice to build something beautiful from whatever materials love provides.